Chin for sponsoring this session. The session today is Building the Next Generation of Leaders. And it's in relation to a treaty implementation and how the massive effort and the ongoing process has been, and how do we best support and motivate and mobilize our youth to take on the challenge of nation rebuilding in the modern treaty context. We'll be hearing from Kluani Adamek, who's the founder of Our Voices, Karen Ristol, fellow at the Public Policy Forum, Sashia Leung, Associate Director of the BC Treaty Commission, and Saher Gulshan and Diane Hill with the Canadian Roots Exchange. Just a brief introduction, I think, is something that I don't know if it would give it the credit that's needed to understand these young women and what they've been doing across Canada and within the Indigenous community. Kluani and myself, we both co-chair Our Voices, and we've been friends for a few years now. And it's really great to meet the rest of the panel yesterday and today. And in terms of building the next generation of leaders and how we move forward, I think all of you play a part in that, because we cannot move forward in a way that needs to happen without all of you, without all the knowledge that you have in terms of modern treaties and about educating the younger generation and the way we move forward. First of all, I think Kluani's going to go first, and then we'll move down the line. So Masi.
Let me know when I'm at 5. How much do I have? 13. Good afternoon, everyone. Danche, Kluani Adamek Uye, Dachluedi Ayahat, Geyo Hatu Asauk, Kluan Man Kai Iche, Ganach Chish, Algonquin Kwan, Ganach Chish. My name is Kluani Adamek, and I'm from Kluani First Nation in the southwest Yukon. And I'm also from the Killer Whale, Dachluedi clan, and my Tlingit name is Age, which means daughter of the lake. And my ancestry comes on my Indigenous side from Kluani Lake. There's a photo shown for you there. My grandmother is Southern Shoshone from Burwash Landing, and my grandfather was Tlingit, and his roots originated from Carcross and the Dai area. I wanted to, of course, acknowledge the unceded territory of the Algonquin people, where we're gathered here today, and also wanted to make a special acknowledgement to Uncle Bob, Chief of Kluani First Nation, and really pleased to see him here at this session with some remarkable Indigenous women. And I gotta say, Jordan, it's pretty great that all 5 panelists are Indigenous women, and no surprise there. Jordan's also pretty great. So in terms of the session today, I was thinking a lot about perhaps what to share or the reflections that I have, and the first piece I wanted to share is this is beautiful Kluani Lake, and Luan Man in Southern Shoshone, and Uchani in Tlingit, so Big Fish Lake, Whitefish Country. So I wanted to just provide you just a photo of where my ancestors are from. This photo was taken just this fall when myself on the left, Uncle Hank, who's one of the eldest uncles in our family. He carries the name Coolseen after great uncle Patsy Henderson, who was part of the group of people who discovered the gold rush. That's the real story. Next, we have Crystal McLean, and then, of course, my dad. So in terms of Kluani and what's important to us, our lake, the river, hunting, moose, sheep, fishing for lake trout, are all really important parts of who we are as Kluani people. Again, we're mainly Southern Shoshone and have a lot of Tlingit ancestry as well in our nation. And one of the biggest reflectors, I think, in terms of thinking about how do we build this next generation of leaders, one thing I've often heard from a number of elders, both from my community and outside, is that to know where you're going, you have to know where you come from. And it's so important to balance what it is in terms of our cultural protocols, our understanding of who we are and where we've come from, with this whole idea of the Western world. For example, formal education, process, policies. What do those look like, and how do you balance that with your cultural protocols, your community, and what's really important to you and your nation? This is a photo of Aunt Geraldine, Uncle Bob's wife, my grandma and my dad, and this was at a recent potlatch. And as we talk about building this next generation of leaders, it's always important for us to reflect on what is it that the former leaders had to go through? What is it that supported them in being the strongest leaders they could be, and how do we translate that to this next generation? So I think about, negotiating our agreements in the Yukon that started in the 70s. I think about all of those chiefs and leaders who came to Ottawa, met with former Prime Minister Trudeau, and Elijah Smith was really clear in saying it wasn't for a handout, it was here for, they were there for their rights to be acknowledged. And so that's the story of my grandmother's generation. Then we look to, my dad, Gerald, and Uncle Bob's generation, being the ones who were doing the negotiations, right? Being the ones who were setting up the framework of what these agreements look like. And my dad often talking about being really young. I see our former Grand Chief, Ed Schultz, here in the room as well, who, were the younger people around the tables when they were selecting land parcels and going through that process. And that was their experience. And now we're into our generation. And so what does that mean for us in terms of taking those legacy pieces, but ensuring that our generation of young people also have a seat at the table, also have a voice, also have an understanding? And so that's where I see all the leadership and our elders and our young people all having a joint responsibility to learn and to share, but most importantly, that young people have a voice that often is not included in a way that provides them with the ability. And I say that meaning, let's just have a youth come to this meeting, or maybe there's a youth council member in the community, but how are their voices really heard? How are they really involved in decision making? What does that look like for each community? And there's a lot of incredible young people out there who want to be at the table and assert themselves. There's also a lot of young people who may not be quite comfortable with that yet, but who need to be supported to be there. And so I see this gap from my grandmother to my dad's generation, where everyone was brought to the meeting. Everyone sat around at the Council of Yukon First Nations General Assemblies. Most of the time it was on the land or in the meeting rooms, right? The kids who would be there, and my dad talks about that. But in our generation, that's not happening. And being very, open and honest here, that I think that in the challenges that we have been faced with in terms of implementation of our agreements in the Yukon, there has then been this gap of engagement of young people. So why shouldn't every young person fully understand our agreements, understand that we have the abilities to make laws in our territories? Those are really important things. However, it's not just our young people who don't perhaps understand that, it's all of the young people in the Yukon. And if the college in the Yukon can have a course that's mandatory for all its students, then why aren't the high schools doing that? And why haven't they done that? And how come they haven't worked with young people to figure out what it is that they want to learn? And specific to who we are, where we come from, and what our agreements really stand for. So that's my challenge to leadership, is to say, wait a minute. If a young person wants to go to university, develop their skills, experience something outside and bring that knowledge home, I don't see why we create barriers for them to do that. And it happens often, where there becomes the application process that's daunting, or there's just no money, sorry. Well, I think that we need to get a little bit more creative than that. In fact, we have to. If we want young people to be at the table, and if we're really thinking about 7 generations, then we have to stop limiting how young people are involved, and we have to stop limiting their ability to access what it is they need to be their strongest person in both what they've learned from a cultural perspective and who they are from this Western model. So that's my second challenge. 1, engage your young people. Find out how they want to be engaged and ask them. 2, stop limiting involvement. If you can do anything to support youth in your community, do it. It should just be a yes. Always, it should be a yes. The third thing would be to recognize that youth have a lot of really great solutions. When I say youth, I'm 31, so I'm like pushing the youth boundary, obviously. I identify more as a young leader. But youth can be, 35 and under-ish. And so something that I wanted to share in terms of, acknowledging the panel sponsor today is the Walter and Duncan Gordon Foundation. Jordan mentioned Our Voices, but I think I really want to share a little bit about what that is and showing how young people can create and be inspired to have their own solutions in their communities. All they need is a little bit of support from all of you. So a few years ago, we had a young person in our community who took his own life, and it was incredibly hard being distanced from the community at that time. I was living here in Ottawa, and I had a cousin who was also here, so we supported each other. But in light of that, we sat there and we thought, what are young people doing to support each other? Like, when young people are feeling isolated, it doesn't matter if you're in a rural community or a northern community. You could live downtown Toronto and feel isolated. You could live in Burwash Landing and feel isolated, right? It really is about how do people feel good? What makes them feel good? And how do we support each other more? So I sent out this Facebook message to a number of young people in the Yukon and said, hey, this is what we're experiencing in Kluane. What do you think? And the feedback was awesome. So we had a call. And on that very first call, we identified that we need to have a gathering on the land. There used to be these Yukon Indian games that happened before my generation, but that had kind of fizzled out. And so what can we do to support each other as young people? So I was doing my fellowship with the Walter and Gordon Duncan Foundation and decided I'm going to do youth engagement. That's going to be my project. We're going to host this gathering. It's going to be hosted by a bunch of us. It's going to be on the land. I have no money, but I don't care. So Tides Canada gave me 10 grand and said, this sounds like a great idea, here you go. And we piggybacked that. Our budget ended up being $150,000 for this event, but all we needed was one person to say yes. Yes, we support you. Awesome. Shop that around a little more to the chiefs at the CYFN General Assembly to say, we need your support, we have this awesome idea, we need this in our communities. There's been a lot of loss, a lot by suicide, and we need to address this. And so we were able to get the support we needed. Our Voices has turned into its own organization. We've hosted 3 gatherings with the intention to see Indigenous young people in the North be inspired, be engaged, and be thriving. We didn't ask for permission. We did it because we knew it was important. And we've led every single one of those gatherings in partnership with community. We've branded ourselves. We're a project of Tides Canada initiatives. We've got a steering committee that's representative of all the Yukon and beyond. And it's been incredibly powerful to see the 16 and 17-year-olds, young men in particular, reading poetry, making songs, talking about who they are, asking to please stay up late so they can sit around the fire. Those are the stories of young people in our communities, and in particular in the North, who just need a space and just want the place for their voices to be heard. This is our very first gathering we had at Brooks Brook. Photos doing safe talk, talking about suicide, and ensuring that when we're having these discussions, that we're always mindful of having elders, having supports, having culturally competent clinical counselors. Those are all pieces. Expression through art. You'd be amazed at how young people have been able to express themselves in different ways through just being given the opportunity. At our most recent gathering, we did a water ceremony and a fire ceremony. And the first 2 gatherings, the feds and the territorial government wanted us to have these specific outcomes. So, positive mental health and wellness, being able to build a workforce, all these different elements to get the funding. The last year we said, wait a minute, before we even get to let's get these young people jobs, these young people need to know who they are and they need to feel good about it. And so we totally changed. We said, Yukon Government of Canada, Yukon First Nations, we're going to host a gathering and it's going to be all based on traditional knowledge. Every single workshop we're going to have is going to be about learning skills on the land. That will eventually get us to all of these other things, but that's what we feel is the first step. And we got to a place where then government was like, yeah, okay, we get it, we support you. That's all we needed. And that last gathering proved to be the most successful gathering I think that we've had. Was hosted in partnership with the Champagne-Ajac First Nation, Shana Dakaike, and we had over 100 young people come to that gathering from all across the Yukon, northern BC, and from some of the Gwich'in nations and Northwest Territories. So just an example of how solutions are thought of, developed, and implemented by young people, and all they need is your support. When we're thinking about building leadership amongst our generation, it includes engaging them, being supportive, understanding. The challenges that we face are entirely different than the challenges our parents or our grandparents faced. It doesn't mean that it's any easier, it means that it's different. It's important that we're respectful, and it's important that young people are included at the table. And again, each community, that's going to be different, and that becomes the hard work. That's where the heavy lifting comes in. That's where the questions of, how do youth in my community want to be engaged? What does that mean for them? Those are the questions that leadership and communities really need to start asking themselves so we can be supported. The last thing I think I wanted to share was just how important it is that through some of the ideas that I've shared, the 2 challenges I've offered, I think mentorship is the biggest one. And so, there's always going to be the people who you go to. But I think, if anything, what young people in our generation need is to have that mentorship be open, be offered, and not in way of some paid type of position, but we just want to know that you're going to support us. And we want to know that we're not going to walk into a room and perhaps have to feel uncomfortable and not welcome. It's about genuinely being there and being open to hear what it is that we have to say. And it's about knowing that we have your support 100% of the time. Those are the things that I think are going to support this generation, my generation of being strong leaders. Invite us to the table. Sometimes we just want to sit, sometimes we want to share, but we just need to be at the table. And so with that, I say Shonithan and thank you for the opportunity to share some ideas, and really looking forward to the other speakers. Thanks very much.
Masicho Kluwani. That was really amazing. I haven't actually heard you give that presentation before on Our Voices, so it's pretty empowering to see, because when we had that conversation around how do we build support amongst our peers, it had to come from a place of it being from the youth and for the youth, and I think that in itself proved to be pretty powerful and successful, because over the last 3 gatherings, there's been over 600 youth from northern BC, Yukon, and Northwest Territories, as Kluwani explained. And when we had that first gathering around strategies, I think everyone was feeling the same in a sense that we all needed it at the time. From feeling alone in your own community, that you can't have these conversations with other people, that you're pushed away from leadership, or whatever it may be. And for our communities, one way to battle that was we created a regional youth council, which proved to be really successful. It's in its 4th year now, almost 4th year, and they've played a part in Our Voices and will continue to do so. So with that, thank you, Kluwani. And our next speakers are Sahar Gulshan and Diane Hill from Canadian Roots Exchange.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sahar Gulshan, and I'm non-Indigenous. I'm a settler here. My parents are refugees from Iran and Vietnam. So my mom was part of a migration of boat people, and my father left Iran after the Islamic Revolution in 1979. And so with that, I want to acknowledge the traditional territory of the Algonquin Nation, which is, we're on territory that's unceded and unsurrendered. And specifically, to elaborate on that, you're going to learn that we're a national organization, Canadian Roots Exchange, and so there's a lot of young people who build this work up, and specifically Algonquin youth. I want to acknowledge Danny Lanouette and Thielen Kiknoswe, who I heard you saw hoop dancing last night, and also many knowledge keepers and elders like Nokomis Jane, like Larry McDermott, who bring us here to do this work.
Yeah, sorry, I know you're a little bit shorter. So Sagoli Sogay Gai Duheni Yungets, Ogwal Niwa Gitaloda, Onyada Aga Niwa Gohunjo. I've heard many languages during this conference that I've been here, and I'm pretty proud to be able to speak my language too. I'm not a fluent speaker, but I have learned to introduce myself in my language, as well a little bit of language here and there. My language is the Oneida language, so it's a Haudenosaunee language, and I'm from Oneida Nation of the Thames. That's my First Nations community. So I come from a reserve in which I lived until 18 years old. I moved to Toronto to attend university, so I did leave my community to pursue post-secondary, which I know as well is an issue that a lot of youth really face and sort of have to deal with in terms of having the contentious issue of whether to leave your community or whether you're going somewhere else to pursue other opportunities. And I'm of the Bear Clan, and my spirit name is Gai Duhay, and it means someone who writes, and my English name is Diane. And yeah, we're here with Canadian Roots Exchange, so it's a national youth-led reconciliation organization, and I'll just speak a little bit about why I got involved. Oh, as well, I'm definitely an out-of-territory person, so I'm happy to be here in Algonquin territory, to be a guest here and to be able to speak today, because I think we definitely need to highlight people who are from this territory as well and acknowledge the hard work that they do too. So how I got involved with CRE, Canadian Roots Exchange, is I attended the National Youth Conference this past year, and it was held in Winnipeg. And I heard about Canadian Roots Exchange just here and there, but it was the first time I was able to actually be part of something nationally across the country, where youth from every single province and territory attended. And especially for myself, I haven't had the opportunity to travel a lot. I haven't had the opportunity to really explore a lot of Canada. I really only frequent between my community and Toronto. So it was really good to meet other Indigenous, First Nations, Métis, Inuit youth all across Canada who are doing reconciliation work in their communities and who are really advocating for change. So there's a lot of diversity of thought. There's a lot of issues that are brought to the table on behalf of youth, as well recognizing that some of us are students, but some of us don't even have access to post-secondary institutions, and some of us choose other, paths in life, and what kind of issues come with that. So that's why I got involved, because as a student and as someone who is affected by funding gaps, by loss of language in my lineage, as well loss of culture in my lineage, I'm really passionate about picking up this work, and as well echoing what some of the speakers has already said, that you really need to understand where you come from. So there's a lot of community healing that happens within our organization amongst young Indigenous people, but as well non-Indigenous people, where they come to that understanding and compassion to understand who we are and what are the laws and what are the ceremonies and what are the traditions of our people and how they can respect that in a peaceful relationship.
So CRE, or Canadian Roots Exchange, as Diane said, is a national organization. We've had young people take part in our programs from every single province and every single territory. We're really lucky to do work here in Ottawa, as I said, but we have team members in Nunatsiavut, in Happy Valley Goose Bay, team members in Rankin Inlet, Nunavut, team members in Vancouver, all over the country. One way that we do our work is through exchange programs. So it was actually something that Diane and I were discussing as perhaps a way that some of the folks in the room might want to engage their young people. We have land-based exchange programs between Indigenous and non-Indigenous youth. So for example, just this past year we had an exchange program between 12 youth from Kuujjuaq in Nunavik, northern Quebec, and 12 youth from Ottawa here in unceded Algonquin territory. And they had a week spent in Nunavik learning about Inuit culture, and then 1 week spent in Ottawa learning about Algonquin culture. Those programs are hands-on, where we learn from different traditional knowledge keepers, elders, and ways that young people can meet face-to-face and exchange their culture.
And as well, we also have the YRI program. This is the Youth Reconciliation Initiative program. I'm currently a Toronto YRI person, so Toronto, we even label it Skalundo, so that's the traditional Ganigahaga word for Toronto, where it comes from. So this program and YRIs generally are supposed to be reconciliation teams, and they're also across the province. So these are generally people who are ages, I believe, 18 to 29, who can come together and be part of a group to deliver either workshops, they can deliver programming. It's really youth-driven and self-driven by what this group of either students, artists, activists, scholars want to do. So in Toronto, we are a group of Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, and so our Indigenous folks are very diverse because especially we live in an urban area. So we are comprised Indigenous students and just general participants bring their own teachings and bring their own languages and bring their own knowledge to the table as well. And we talk about the importance of land acknowledgement, we talk about the importance of treaty, we talk about the importance of acknowledging these things, how to make good relationships and this era of reconciliation that we have, as well to understand what does reconciliation mean as young people. Often, I think the thing too, what I really appreciate about some of what was said already is that a lot of young people aren't at these tables. Like even if we look at the tables at these conferences, right? A lot of young people aren't here, and people really need to look at their young people and think about what they want, and think about what does reconciliation mean to them, and understand that reconciliation is a working definition sometimes for young people. And as well, what we try to exhibit within our organization is how reconciliation needs to happen between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. And what does this mean for newcomer Canadians? What does this mean for immigrant Canadians? What does this mean for racialized Canadians? As well, understanding how these healthy relationships come about, how they're rooted in teachings, how they're rooted in the laws and the governance of your territory. That's something that we try to do within YRI. And as well, when we talk about something that really was brought up, which I think I would also like to elaborate more on, was this concept of loneliness, right? A lot of our young people, and I'm not just trying to exclude other generations, but a lot of our young people face a lot of mental health issues as well. And it's not really approached in a culturally sensitive way in a lot of our institutions, whether it's community health centers or whether it's in your academic institution. So for a lot of this healing to happen, we also need that healthy relationship building. So giving youth the skills to actually forge peaceful, reciprocal relationships with each other. So I've seen this definitely happen within our YRI group, where we understand how do these things all come together? How do we approach each other respectfully? How do we understand each other in a culturally competent way? And these are things as well that needs to happen between Indigenous and Indigenous youth, right? Like across the province. So at the conference, I also saw this happen where, I only have 23 years on this earth and I have a lot of learning to do. I've already learned so much at this conference. And what do I need to do as one person to learn more about all these other nations doing their great work in their territory?
So it's not a coincidence that Diane and I are standing up here as non-Indigenous youth and an Indigenous youth. We do our work in what we call a reconciliation model. So at the staff level, at the board level, at the volunteer level, we're all a balance of Indigenous and non-Indigenous young people. There was someone in the last session on the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People who talked about the potential for collaboration and solidarity between refugees, newcomers, generally people of color, Indigenous communities. That's something that we really try to practice and live out in our work. I wanted to speak specifically to something that we were just a part of in the past 2 weeks. It was Treaties Recognition Week in Ontario. Our organization is based in Treaty 6 in Saskatoon, but also our other office is in Toronto, Dish with One Spoon territory. So for 2 weeks, we had over 500 youth engaged in the entire province, in Thunder Bay, Robinson Superior Treaty Territory, in Sudbury, Robinson Huron Treaty Territory, out in Ottawa here where we are today, and in Toronto. We engaged tons of young people, and every session was facilitated by one Indigenous facilitator and one non-Indigenous facilitator. We have extensive trainings where we get young people to learn directly about these wampums in the case of the Dish with One Spoon Treaty in Toronto, or these specific historic treaties that are in Ontario. It's really important that we have these discussions. One experience that I had is we've engaged specifically Syrian refugees to learn about treaties. and residential schools, missing and murdered Indigenous women, Two-Spirit and girls. And the reaction is overall good because there's learning, but there's also a strange reaction in the sense that these folks have left conflict, have left experiences of violence, and to learn that the violence that manifests in their own country is not the same, but there are parallels here, is a bit of a shock for young people that we interact with. But we believe that there is really a huge importance of reciprocity and responsibility in this work, and a lot of non-Indigenous youth need to be learning this stuff so they can bring back this information, this crucial information about how we all benefit from treaties to their communities.
Yes, I was able to deliver some of the workshops during Treaties Recognition Week. It was a lot of educating, but it was still pretty rewarding as well. Something to echo as well with navigating these relationships. Me and another non-Indigenous person delivered to a South Asian legal clinic, and we talked about the importance of recognizing that even those concepts of Indigenous law is also in contention with this idea of Western law. And what does this mean for their profession, bringing that work back to these people and actually sort of trying to illustrate what their responsibility is. As well, we come from a context of being in a really large city, and I think that one of the rewarding things about this treaties recognition work is we're able to do it across the board. So in the Toronto District School Board, there's hundreds of schools, there's hundreds of educators, and so one thing as well recently we've implemented is that these workshops and these educational pieces need to be part of the actual curriculum, and they also need to be part of teacher trainings so that they can understand their responsibility and also deliver that. And I think that's also something that we echoed, and maybe something to take back away from this is that this education needs to happen for young people all across Canada to know their history, to know what kind of negotiations their communities are involved in, to know what type of things are happening for them, and also doing it in a really respectful way. I feel like as well as a young person, what really happens sometimes in our communities is we do get shamed for not knowing our language, or we get shamed from each other for not knowing these certain things. And that's kind of an awkward thing we don't talk about sometimes. But it's really important to approach young people with compassion and peace, and to understand where they're at and respect where they're at, and that there's a lot of learning to do collectively.
Something we really believe in as well is that young people need to be compensated. I'm not talking entirely financially, but that's a big piece. Mm-hmm. The youth who take part in our programs, although we're a nonprofit organization, we do provide them with a modest stipend, given that many of them are students, parents, workers themselves. And they're young people who learn a lot from the program, but are actually people who come in with lots of formal and informal education, knowledge, experience. And so we really think that it's important that young people are compensated for the huge value that they bring to the table, to these conversations.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much it as well. We're here for a little bit more. We have the National Youth Conference coming up, so that's like one way to support us. You can send your youth to your conference, or just let people know about our organization. It's very youth-driven, so we really are youth for youth, and that's sort of our model. So you can look us up, follow us on social media, and that's another thing too, is that as young people, we love social media, we love digital technology. That's the way of the future. So that's how we stay connected with each other as well. It's a big country, but we can still make those connections at the conference, where you make Facebook friends, you meet people, you exchange contact information, and you're building that resiliency together and collectively as a community. So recognizing those things, and thank you for having us.
Yeah. And just to finish up, I wanted to add a little bit of detail on the conference. So our sixth annual conference will take place in Sudbury. That's Robertson Huron Treaty Territory, February 23rd to the 25th. And so we welcome young people from your communities to come take part in that conference. They have the opportunity to facilitate. So like this conference, there's lots of sessions, but they're all led by youth, typically led by Indigenous and non-Indigenous youth. There's a keynote speaker, all these different folks who present, and we think it's a terrific opportunity for young people, perhaps in your community. About 200 youth from across this country will be in attendance. So we'd love to talk to you afterwards. Thanks so much for the opportunity. Thank you, Rosanna, and the Land Claims Agreement Coalition for the opportunity. Woo! Yeah.
Wasn't that amazing? Thank you, Sahar and Diane. That was really empowering. I wish I had the voice you have at 21, 22 years old. So with that, we'll move on to our next speaker, Karen Ristol.
If it's okay, I'm just going to do my talk from here. Sasha and I decided we're going to sit back. Is that my alarm? Because I just got started. Good afternoon, everyone. Karen Restool from Dokis First Nation. For those of you who don't know where that is, it is on a river called the Wide River, also known as the River with Two Mouths, and more commonly known today post-contact as the French River. That leaks into Lake Nipissing, so it's about a 4 or 5 hour drive from here. Anishinaabe Nation, and also signatory to the Robinson-Huron Treaty that some of you may have heard about in the news recently, or perhaps followed the legal proceedings, where we did lay a claim against the Crown for non-compliance of their treaty obligations. Now, many people look at the Robinson-Huron Treaty and other treaties that were signed in that era and say, well, that's not a modern treaty. And I disagree, because it should be today. And had it not been for really bad federal policy that was developed and imposed on our communities over the course of many, many years, that treaty would be modern today. We would be living comfortably, not without conflict, I'm sure, or disagreement, but we would be living under the parameters, the true parameters of what was set out in that treaty. And so, today we know that. And so today, what are we doing about it? What are we doing about that 150 years? Where are the reparations? How are we handling that? And this is one of the questions that our leadership took very seriously, and that led to the claim before the courts. I'm also a daughter, a sister, and an auntie. Recently became an auntie twice in the last couple of years, and I am learning so much. Like, don't give your 2-year-old niece a big bottle of Gatorade. For those of us who don't have kids, that was news to me. High levels of sodium, high levels of sugar. Her mom and dad were not impressed, but she's still alive, and I've learned my lesson. That's what aunties do. So I want to go back to my role as a daughter. I had the privilege of being raised by this amazing Anishinaabe man who, among other things, had a passion for hockey. And throughout the course of my life, I witnessed him being involved both within our community through the sport of hockey, but also externally through the sport of hockey. And there were benefits. I saw the benefits to both. Externally, he used the sport of hockey to create a common ground with the non-Indigenous people, the non-Indigenous communities around ours, and used it as a way to bring people together and allow for an exchange of knowledge between our community and the French-Canadian communities around us, well, on our territory, really, technically, if we want to get technical. And through those relationships, through the sport, it facilitated an exchange of knowledge that led to an increased understanding of who we are and where we come from, what our perspectives are, what our worldviews are, and also increase the level of respect that we shared with our neighbors. Internally, I saw the sport of hockey feed the warrior spirit of the men at home. And bringing in the youth was something that my dad prioritized. So if he got together, let's just say informally on the outdoor rink one February weekend, if he got together with the folks, his age, his cousins, his brothers, he would always encourage everybody to bring their kids. And he would always make sure that there was room on the ice for them. So there would be a competitive part of the afternoon where the men competed, but there would also be a more inclusive part of the afternoon where the youth were coming in and they would have a game with the kids. And so over time, I saw the benefits of this, not only with my brothers, but other kids in the community. And it really increased the sense of pride and understanding, I reference warrior spirit, understanding what their roles are as young men and young women in our community. And this is really, we're now seeing, has equipped our youth with the tools necessary to navigate today's challenges, whether it's on the ice or off the ice. So having been raised in this way, I now recognize as a privilege, and since my dad's passing, I've been doing a lot of thinking about how to honor his gifts and honor his legacy. And so one thing that I've committed myself to doing is bringing that approach that he used with the sport of hockey into everything that I do. So in my final year of law school, I teamed up with some folks at Canadian Lawyers Abroad, and we developed a justice education and mentoring program that brought together youth of ages 11, 12, and 13, and lawyers and law students, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, into one setting. And initially, we thought we would just run a criminal mock trial. But within the first couple sessions, I recognized that there was a huge component missing, and it was the sharing of knowledge from the youth to the legal community. And where they had that strength, without actually naming it Indigenous law, the youth carried teachings within their stories and their songs, and they shared their stories and songs with the legal community. And over the course of the year, we incorporated more activities where the youth would share their teachings and what they'd learned and in the language. And we saw over the course of the year that it became a true relationship, a true partnership. They found common ground, but a common respect for the different laws that they carried, and were able to incorporate Indigenous laws into the common law processes. So that was pretty exciting. In my former role as Director of Justice at the Chiefs of Ontario, I led a few projects. One of the last ones that I organized before stepping away from that role was the Indigenous Legal Principles Project. And so this was post-TRC release. We had an emphasis, a call to action that focused on revitalizing Indigenous laws. Luckily, we had a friendly government in Ontario who provided us with the funding to bring in knowledge keepers to start discussing and sharing those stories, the stories that held legal principles that governed our community. And for us, it was very important that we set aside some funds to have youth included in that initiative. And so what that looked like, we had approximately 80 people in the room, and I would say about just a little over half were the knowledge keepers, and there was about 20 to 30 youth in the room as well, to help facilitate that transfer of knowledge and empower them with that knowledge to move forward. Most recently, I founded an organization called Bold Realities. It hosts very tough and critical discussions between industry and Indigenous communities. It can be quite contentious and heated at times, but a necessary discussion, because most of those talks that are happening behind closed doors in the pressure cooker of a negotiations table. And Bold Realities looks to remove that conversation from the pressure cooker and bring everyone into a room where we're not feeling that pressure, where we're not feeling the demands, and we're not focusing on our interests, but rather listening and learning from one another and understanding, making an effort to understand each other's perspectives. One important thing that we did at Bold Realities is that we recognize that youth are often not a part of those conversations. They're not a part of any industry, resource development type conversations. I don't know if anyone's ever noticed this, but it's usually gray-haired people at those tables. And that's a lapse. That's a missed opportunity in our opinion. And so one of the commitments that we've made is every conversation that we host at Bold Realities has a reserved seat for an Indigenous youth, to bring that perspective, to help reframe the conversation from that perspective, understanding what our discussions mean for the future of our communities and those relationships. And so I guess the takeaway is we should open doors, not necessarily hold hands, but create opportunity, create space by just, making room. And if you don't see youth, or if there are rooms or, meetings where youth would not normally be a part of it, that should be your flag. That should be your red flag that tells you we need youth. So every time you look around and see no youth, that's that kind of slap in the face, so to speak, that they should probably be a part of that conversation. We can't pick and choose what conversations they should be a part of. It's not just about including them in youth-led initiatives and groups, youth groups and whatnot. Our communities never functioned that way prior to contact. Why would we function that way today? And so with that, I'll leave it to Sasha. Thank you.
Well, I think everyone covered everything, so we can all call it end of day. Sorry, no, I'll provide a bit of input. So, Denizet, Zekazet, Skyzet, Masai Kyo to the Algonquin people for allowing us to do this important work on their traditional territory. Hati, good afternoon. My name is Sashia Liang, and I'm very proud to be Wet'suwet'en on my mother's side and Chinese on my father's side. I grew up in northern interior BC in Wet'suwet'en, which is also known as Morristown. I mention this because we recently began to reclaim our traditional names, and we're now legally known as Wet'suwet'en. I now find myself in Vancouver. I'm an associate director with the BC Treaty Commission. So today, I will talk to you about how we and you can support and motivate and mobilize our young people to take on the challenge of nation building, rebuilding, and I'll also share some experiences and some successes that we've had at the Treaty Commission. So when I was asked to present, I really thought about the theme of this conference, a new relationship 150 years later. It made me think of the realities that our people and our young people have had to survive for the last 150 years and the challenges we are faced with then and now. Amongst our young people, we have high dropout rates in school, high unemployment rates, and high rates of suicide. Today, we still live with the intergenerational trauma of residential school and colonialism. And it made me think of a phrase that an elder once told me, because sometimes I get super disheartened when I think about all the hurt that we've had in the last 150 years and a lot of the healing that we need to do in our communities and with Canada. And so the phrase was, hurt people, hurt people. And so when I think of a new relationship, I don't think of the relationship with the Crown. I'm thinking about the most important relationship, which is with our people, and especially with our young people. So I entitle my presentation, Empowered People, Empower People. We need to put the power where our hearts are, which is with our people, and for this presentation, with our young people. And I'm not calling them youth, I call them young people, because I think too often we separate a youth as, being youth, and they'll lead their youth programs and leadership. But we need to lead that with them, and we need to empower them. So, even within the word empower, there are some good strategies. So we need to support and provide education, mentorship, persistence, ownership, willingness, experience, and recognition. I think the most important is the first one, which is education. All of us need to have an education strategy about nationhood, and it doesn't begin in high school. It starts at an early age and in elementary school. In my community, we teach and empower our children with our traditional teachings, our cultural protocols, our languages, and we teach them about who we are. We are potlatch people. We have a strong traditional governance system. We have clans, hereditary chiefs, and in elementary school, we do this by bringing them into the feast hall, but as well having mini feasts with them. The children know who they are and where they sit when they come into the House of Governance. I am from the Liksamasu clan, the Fireweed and Killer Whale clan. I am from the Grouse House, and my head chief is Smoketskim. In addition to instilling traditional teachings with modern education, we need to include the education of our nations and how we have strengthened and protected our nations through treaty. Treaty didn't create our nations. Our nations have been sovereign nations since time immemorial. And treaty is a tool and mechanism that constitutionally protected our ways of being in these modern times. Yesterday, I was in this room, and it was about communication strategies and how do we engage our community and have support. Little did I know they were really wanting to get information from us, and how do we involve the youths, and how do you encourage and speak to them. And as well, they also encouraged us to share more of our experiences and to speak from a place of experience. So I'd like to share an education strategy that the BC Treaty Commission does. We don't always think that we're experts in a lot of the work that we do, but we try to tap in and utilize things that are working. So we go to the youth. And for example, in the last few years, we've gone to the conference, Gathering Our Voices. It's a national conference that invites youth from across Canada, ages 14 to 19, I think. And we participate in this by educating the youth about negotiations and treaty. We facilitate mock negotiations, and it works with the youth. We call this youth empowerment through reconciliation negotiations. The workshop puts young people into a place of decision-making. It has them collaborate on strategies for the negotiations, and it demonstrates how through negotiations and working with others that you can begin the pathway of reconciliation. The goals is to empower youth to take on leadership roles in their community. Often they're looking, what's beyond, we all know we grow up, we get older. So we're hoping that encourages them to take on more leadership roles in their community and specifically in modern treaty communities. Some of the feedback that we've had from the youth, and these are just quotes from some of the young people, I always think of reconciliation as good guys versus bad guys. But after stripping away the race element, it was harder to see groups as good or bad. It changed my perspective. Another youth said, "This really helped me with problem solving in both planned and unplanned situations." Youth walked away saying that they love this, and that they should be a part of their nation's leadership. So for us, we felt like it was successful. Another thing I want to say as well, in addition to not only elementary school, but middle school, that in high school, that you have other opportunities for education. A specific example that I would recommend is teaching your high school students about your nation constitution, about your nation vision. It also helps them understand your nation operations, and as well, roles and jobs that they can do in your nation. And I do want to stress the point that Kluani had brought up and all of the other panelists, which is we need to remove funding barriers to those young people who are trying to access education. On to the M, mentorship. This is crucial in the development of self-confidence, leadership, and role modeling. There's direct results of success linked with mentorship. We've all had a mentor in our life that has empowered us, guided us. We now have that responsibility to pay that forward. As self-governing nations, I really encourage you to make mentorship mandatory in all of your positions with your government. Okay, on to P, and I won't spend too long on this one, persistence and being proactive. Being persistent and proactive, you have to be. You may not connect with the young person when you first meet with them, but eventually you'll reach out to them. Meet them on their level, find out what they're interested in, and use it as a way to get them engaged. Yesterday, I was in a session, and John Jack, who is a young leader from the Hawaiian First Nation, said that we need to practice good governance in public. And so my addition to that is to bring your young people into the practice of good governance in public, stand them up in public, and applaud them for all of their leadership efforts. And then next is ownership. Our young people need to feel that nationhood is relevant to them and that they have ownership in their nation. I have the privilege of going around to different communities, attending AGMs, and specifically I'll share a story in which I went to the Tanaha First Nation, and they had a group of 3 young people stand up in front of everyone, and they had to provide the financials and reporting of activities for the money that the leadership had given them for the activities that year. So it's bringing them into the work that we do. And as well, I'll mention that they had each day, because it went over 3 days, they had a youth co-facilitator that facilitated the discussions and all of the work. So I thought that was great. W, willingness. Whenever I'm giving presentations to young people, I always tell them, get that W. When with willingness. And I always tell them, and it's a basketball analogy, but you're always going to miss 100% of the shots that you don't take. So have the willingness to try and do it. This also means we need to have the willingness to be there to support our young people, to put them in a position where they can try, to put them especially in a position of leadership. We need to support them, we need to hear their voices, and we need to understand what is important to them, because it's important to us. I'm almost there. I'm at my second E, which is experience. And I think that this is the third most important thing in addition to education and mentorship. It is so important that we provide our young people with meaningful experiences. Experiences of leadership, work experience, internships. Yesterday I had met Peter, who I think is in the crowd, and he is an intern that is here, and Jordan was telling me about what's going on in their nation, and it really reminded me of my own experience in BC, which is with the Aboriginal Youth Internship Program. And it provides young people with professional work experience. Each year they have 25 youth from across BC that do a 9-month placement with ministries and 3-month placement with Indigenous organizations. It's in its 11th year. And so that means that there was 275 youth that have participated in this internship program. Program alumni have gone on to work in leadership positions, including becoming chiefs of their nations, executive directors, doctors, university students, lawyers, and others have stayed to work with the provincial employees as well as Treaty First Nations. Where I think this can go and grow, and I'm really talking to the BC Treaty First Nations here, I see Niska leadership here, is I think that this can expand, that Treaty First Nations should be a part of it. Instead of the 9-month placement in the BC government, it should be a 9-month placement with a Treaty First Nation and 3 months working with the BC government. Or where this also could go, and I hope, is that the Land Claims Agreements Coalition or some national organization can support maybe 2 youth from the 29 modern treaty First Nations across Canada, and support something like this. And they don't have to necessarily work for their First Nation, but do an exchange and work with other First Nations. So, lastly, recognition. We need to recognize and acknowledge our young people for who they are, not only as our future leaders, but also as leaders now in our nations. We need to recognize and respect that they have a voice, and we need to listen to their voice, and we need to bring them into decision making. Now, to bring it full circle, we also need to recognize that we have the responsibility as empowered people to empower people. As strong nations, we need to empower our young people so that we can change which rates are high. I hope to hear more of thriving nations with empowered young people with high graduation rates, high employment rates, and high rates of success. Thank you very much for hearing me. Masaikyo.
I don't know what you're talking about being shy, Sashia. That was pretty good. Thank you all. That was really amazing. I think acknowledging Peter and Kaylin, I'm not sure if Kaylin's in here as well, but she's our other intern within the Gwich'in Tribal Council. But really wanting to acknowledge people like Diane Baxter, who works in our implementation office, of having the foresight of creating these types of projects, because the internship that we have established is a 3-year internship. It's 1 year with the Gwich'in Tribal Council, 1 year with the Government of Canada, and 1 year with the Government of the Northwest Territories. After that, it's a free-for-all for who gets those people, but it's empowering because these youth or these young people are declaring what direction that they want to go in, and we find the positions or create the positions within our organizations and governments to make sure that that happens. Some of the key points that I've taken away from today's panel is that nation rebuilding is and has been something that's been ongoing since the 70s. When I think about the Indian Brotherhood and AIM in the United States and everything that they've been able to give so that we can get to where we are right now is really empowering. I mean, if you look around this room right now and all of our Indigenous leaders that were there in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and even more recently in the 21st century, being able to negotiate these modern treaties is something in itself and really empowering. But as the entire panel has stated today, we as leaders and as older leaders need to make that space. You can't say that we don't have money, we don't have this or that, because it's not just about money. It is about mentorship. And when I think about our voices and everything that all these amazing women have been doing within what they're working on, we've done it ourselves. We didn't wait for leadership to tell us it's okay. And that's exactly what all of the leaders in the 70s, 80s, and over the last 150 years have done. So think back at your experience, your involvement, and the direction that you've been given by your elders, and how do you ensure that you are stepping into those same roles when you were dragged into the conference or meeting room or boardroom at 18 years old and said, this is what you're going to do and this is the way it's going to be. Because I've heard a lot of those stories from the Yukon, Northwest Territories, and beyond. And that is what's needed, and that's why I've really tried to support Peter. I encouraged him to apply for the internship program. I encouraged him to apply for for the Jane Glasgow Fellowship that both myself and Kluani were a part of, and actually has an interview at 4 o'clock today, so let's all get behind him and hopefully he gets into the program, because it's been really amazing for me. It's really empowering, ladies, because when I look into my own community, and I'm pretty sure all of our communities, it's women that run things, and if you go to a funeral, feast, whatever it may be within our communities, it's the women that are holding our communities together, and it's really powerful to see a panel such as this, to where we're going and how much everyone has given up for us to be able to sit up here. So there's mics out there. Please use them if you have questions, but I'll start off with one I think that I want to hear about, and that's, what was the turning point for you that made you say, we need to do something? Karen?
I think I shared earlier about my dad's passing, and one of the beauties, one of the great teachings that comes with somebody moving on to the spirit world is that through all of his relationships, you revisit what that person meant to so many people. And hearing those stories about how my dad approached everything just from a relationships first perspective. And everyone said how valued they felt. And this was folks of all ages. And so it's interesting how, you know, you're raised in an environment, and sometimes the things that are the closest to us are the things we don't see. And so with his passing, and through all of those stories that my brothers and I heard, for me it was really an awakening to recognize the value and importance of honoring relationships regardless of age, and the benefits that come with moving forward in a more inclusive way. And I know the focus is on young people today, but also talking about elders and women, and making sure that the entire community is involved in discussions and decision-making processes. So I would say that that would probably be my biggest turning point.
I think there was this organization called Salkajana in Burwash Landing for Kluane First Nation, and it was created as part of the Aboriginal Healing Foundation when they had done the call for all these projects across the country. So Salkajana and Bob, Uncle Bob, was involved with that as well. I also want to acknowledge our former Deputy Chief, Robin Bradish, who's here, as well as Rhonda Knockwood, a colleague from school. Nice to see you. But Salkajana was about addressing the impacts of residential school in our community, and one of the parts of the program was all the elders went to this big gathering, and I think it was in 2003 or 2004, and it was in Edmonton at the Shaw Center. I remember that because I had never been to a place that big before, and I remember walking in, and it was like all of these residential school survivors, and they all had blankets, and Phil Fontaine was speaking, and it was just so powerful, where I had heard a little bit of what had happened, in particular at Lower Post with my grandmother and her brothers and sisters. But it was like a moment of, wow, like this goes so far, this goes beyond, just Burwash, and I get that now. So there was that moment, I think, where it was like, what can we do? Like, how can we also support all the other young people who are dealing with the impacts of residential school, because we all are, there's no question. So there was that moment, and then it was also linked to that in university when I was in a Canadian Studies course. I did my undergraduate at Carleton in Ottawa, and the professor asked, so how many people heard about residential school? And like nobody raised their hand, and I was like, what? Like none of you have any concept of this, like at all? And so it was the linkages that I made from that high school experience to the university experience to then saying, you know, all of the issues that are happening amongst our young people are directly related to those experiences of our parents and our grandparents. And so what is it, right, as our generation that we need to do to move on with healing and to be able to advance in a way that we want to? So I just wanted to flag that. And also to say that, you know, in terms of the support, and perhaps where I started to get involved was to say, there's always going to be these vulnerable people in our community, and we need to be measuring where our most vulnerable are to know where we are as a nation. Equally so, there's some people who are doing incredibly awesome things, and we can't forget about them either, right? So I find often we go directly to places and people in places, you know, for our young people who are on assistance or who are dealing with issues in the justice system. Like, those are all really important. We need to support those people. They are our most vulnerable. But let's not forget about the person who just finished university, or the person who might be in university and who needs support, or that artist who's just trying to make ends meet and who is incredible, who is an incredible artist. Like, not all of our young people are necessarily going to want to come home, and that's okay, right? Because the most successful people we have as part of our nation, whether they're doctors, whether they're artists, whether they're doing contract work, maybe they're in the community or not, our nation as a whole is going to be stronger with the more healthy people that we have. And I think quite often we lose sight of that. And so I'm on a tangent. People who know me know I like to talk, but I think that's really important. And those are often the moments that I take to refresh and say, where are all of our people at, and how are they all being supported? Because they all need it. So.
Yeah, I can answer. Again, I want to point out that I've been learning a lot over the last few days, like the last day as well, about all these territories and the issues that are going on there. So I definitely speak from a different perspective, and just noting the importance of that. And the question was, what was the turning point that made you want to do more? So I grew up in my reserve in southwestern Ontario, and there's a lot of poverty, and there's a lot of issues that go on in our community, especially in regards to young people. So as a Haudenosaunee person, I didn't grow up Longhouse. I didn't grow up with my tradition or with my language. And even back to my grandparents' age, they had their language, but in my lineage that was lost. And I don't put that blame on my ancestors. I feel like I try to move forward and make peace with that. And as well as a young person, I have the ability now to go search that out and actually pick that up. So I feel like that's been something that I've been trying to do as well. So I also want to give that context and give that perspective, because I don't have that. And that's something that I'm working towards. So because I did grow up in my community and I did see a lot of the issues that my peers faced, and especially going to an on-reserve school, there was a lot of things that I was exposed to in terms of underfunding, as well as just seeing the disparities and the hardships that a lot of our people faced. As well, my mom is a single mom, so she raised me and my brother. So that was sort of another thing that, you know, was always inherently involved in our family, that we all needed to work hard to support each other, and we all needed to work hard to sort of like make our relationships work. And I feel like for myself, I've always done youth work, I've always been involved with programs. I was always that student where I saw the poster and I went to the group and I went and I met everyone. And those are the things that actually really helped me in my life. Because I think a lot of the time when we talk about youth and our young people, we talk a lot about the hardships that they face. And I feel so grateful to even be on a panel and have people sharing their own experiences, because that's something really important to highlight as well. And I think for myself, a lot of the work that's being done around reconciliation, a lot of youth work, isn't possible without the love and without the compassion on behalf of our community members. And I think for myself, it wasn't really until I felt a lot of compassion and love from other people in my community and other young people and young adults who showed that they cared. It's kind of an emotional question, because recently someone else asked me, they were like, oh, how do you do this educating work? Because a lot of my work does focus on education. A lot of my interests in university, I'm as well a university student, does focus on education and wanting to have the larger society actually understand where we're coming from and actually understand what our nations and our communities need. So a lot of my work and my activism focuses on education and public awareness and understanding what these things actually mean for Indigenous people in our own community context. And it wasn't until I was in high school and I was a teenager where someone else from my community told me that they cared and told me that I was important, that I was valued. So that really inspired me to really have mentors and grow that mentorship with other people. Because I don't think that a lot of people understand the importance of words and how much these words can mean to teenagers or to people even younger than that, right? Children as well. I continue this work because I think of the next generations. Like this work and these stories and these like everything that we do, everything everyone does in this room surpasses all of our lifetimes, whether we know it or not. So it's really important to understand that and do it with care. And I feel like that really inspired me to pick up the work and to understand who I am, but as well cultivate that in young people and in the work that we do as an organization, and generally in my own personal life, bring that back to my family so that I can heal those relationships with family members that have gone through different things, that have, like all the bad things we talk about. So yeah, it's kind of like my long answer. And I think it's really important to support each other in this community and in this work, and to understand the importance of building resiliency, because again, I think a lot of the time in the media or in public awareness, we see a lot of things that are very trauma-centered. They're very much focusing on negatives and wrongdoings of the past, instead of how do we actually build resiliency in young people and show them that they're worthy, right? That they don't have to turn to these things that can impact their life very negatively. So, yeah.
Thank you, Diane. We'll go to the question on the floor.
Hi, my name is Maiti Sagnash. I'm an EU from Waswanipi First Nation, which is in the EUST, James Bay area. I want to talk about lateral violence because, I'm an activist. I'm a columnist at Metro Montreal, and I also work with the youth who struggle in communities. And lateral violence is something that I hear about a lot. This is also a factor that pushed me to attempt suicide twice, actually. And, I faced a lot of lateral violence myself because I'm mixed. My dad's Cree and my mom's white, and I've been raised out of the community. And, even though I spent all my summer in the bush, when I was in Quebec City, people told me I was too Indian. And in my community, people thought I was white, and I was not part of my community. And I feel that's the case for a lot of Indigenous youth across Canada, and even on my territory. And I lost my language, and it's been a huge issue. Kids in my community were making fun of me. But also, I chose to heal in a traditional way, what we call the Red Road. And I faced a lot of discrimination because of that in my community. There's the Pentecostal church. And those tensions, we don't address them a lot, but I shouldn't be shamed for joining a culture that accepts me as a woman and a two-spirited person. But I've also noticed a lot of lateral violence in grassroots movements. And I think we're all part of what I call indigenous elites. And that's something really wrong, actually. And I used to have this speech in communities, and the kids in my community wouldn't relate because they didn't know what I was talking about. And sometimes we shame the dropouts or people who chose to live in the bush, because where I come from, 30% of my people still live a traditional way of life. But by occupying the territory, they're actually defending our resources and our culture. But I've noticed a lot of indigenous academics, they really sometimes discriminate, and I've noticed lateral violence at Quebec Native women in WAC as well. And that's what made me want to, not be part of these movements anymore. So how do you fight lateral violence in your work or your community, perhaps?
We're all supporting each other to who's going to speak first.
Oh, I guess I'll speak. Yeah, we're all supporting each other. We're coming to consensus on who's going to speak. So I actually asked this at one of our trainings as well. Again, we're a youth organization. So I think we are, again, we do activist work, and we do involve a lot of folks who are involved in grassroots movements. So essentially, I'm pretty sure I asked this at one of our last trainings because I really appreciate a lot of the sharing that's happening in this space as well, because I feel like when we hear that, it really shows the vulnerability of people to be willing to share, and that's really important. I want to acknowledge that. And I think that for myself, I've even faced a lot of lateral violence. So for example, I'm from my community, and both my parents are from my community, but I didn't grow up Longhouse, I didn't grow up traditional, so a lot of youth in my community make fun of me, or they either stigmatize me, or they say that I'm not actually this, I don't belong to this, I'm not a member of the community, I'm not this because I didn't grow up this way. But then, you have all these tensions, right? And I feel like honestly, in my personal opinion, I feel like lateral violence is a byproduct of the Canadian state. It's something imposed on us to fight with each other, because that's what this colonial project is trying to make us do, is infight with each other. They don't have to kill us, we'll just kill each other. So that's my personal opinion on it. So I feel like in order to heal from that and to understand each other, we really have to look at what are the tenets of our teachings? What do they actually say? And some people, so I'm Haudenosaunee, so a lot of that comes from the teachings of the Turo Wampum and these tenets of peace, trust, and friendship, and that you need to uphold that in every single relationship. So if it's a relationship with the land, with animals, with plants, or with other people. So what does this actually mean? And when I asked this at one of our last trainings, that's essentially what someone had told us, this knowledge keeper. He had said, all you really have to do is you have to look back at these teachings, and what do they actually teach you? Because I think that we kind of, sometimes the most simplest things can be the answers a lot of the time. And I think that combating lateral violence is something that definitely needs to happen in Indigenous communities, because, and a lot of it too is projecting of someone's own anger or frustration, or their own sort of anger, fear at the state, at themselves, at their family, to produce this infighting, when in reality, we kind of just need to understand each other and have that compassion, have a lot of empathy, and really spread the peace. That's one thing that I took away from our trainings with our Haudenosaunee elders, was that, spreading the peace, what does that actually mean? How are you living a peaceful life? And then how are you exuding that among your family, among your people, among other people you're working with? And especially in grassroots organizing and activism, it can be really hard, because we like to play identity politics. We like to say, well, you're this, you're this, you're this. And who's really traditional? Who's really this? And really, I think all Indigenous people are on their healing journey, and they're going to be where they are, and we have to respect that and respect each other. Even in these types of spaces, even thinking about who's not here, right? Who are the people who aren't here from our communities? And really thinking about how do we combat that as a community, because how do we spread that healthiness amongst our people? And I feel like in young people it happens a lot because of technology and social media. We're seeing a real uprising, and we're seeing a lot of people, you know, online and being active about being proud to be Indigenous, but as well what that can produce is online bullying as well, online infighting, and saying like who's better than who. But in reality, I think it's about spreading the peace, and as well, most importantly, you need to be at peace with yourself, because a lot of the time when this happens, it's a projection of someone and their own anger or frustration. So I think that's really important.
I just want to draw your attention, I was on Twitter earlier today, and the artist Chief Ladybird tweeted a hashtag, and I don't know if she started it or where it started, but it's replacing it with hashtag lateral love and focusing on building each other up and pointing out the good that we are all contributing rather than focusing on the negative and throwing that mud around. Let's reframe it in a way that builds up our communities, that builds up our people, our young people, that builds us up as nations. And it really starts at that fundamental level. It really starts at that personal interaction. And once we can, you know, focus positively on that, we will feel that as a collective. So everyone take out your phones and look at the hashtag lateral love.
I just wanted to, is it Mété? Okay, bon, je suis correct. Merci, thank you for addressing that, and also, you know, it's not easy to, you know, necessarily speak from a place of vulnerability, so thank you for doing that as well. I think that, as Karen was mentioning, it is so easy to get wrapped up in the, you know, the gossip or the he said, she said, or the, you know, let's bring this person down. And quite often, I've dealt with that a ton, simply from leaving your community, perhaps. You think you're better than, all those comments that you may hear. So I think it's just about staying true to you and finding the supports, finding your people, and making sure that you know who your support network is. Because I think quite often it's when you're feeling really isolated that then the lateral violence and the comments are, you know, it's easier to take it personally rather than to say, wait a minute, I know that this is way more about you, it has actually nothing to do with me. And that's your own SHIT, thank you very much, right? But it's not easy to say that all the time, nor is it, especially if you're walking into a space that that may be an uncomfortable space or a space that you don't know. So let's be social media friends. But back to what Karen's saying, like it's about supporting each other and checking ourselves in moments where we may be saying something that we all do that's not kind about somebody, that isn't coming from a place of truth, that isn't coming from a place of real experience. It's a conversation that you hear and you jump into. So I just wanted to thank you very much for your openness and your honesty, and that I think it is entirely going to be up to us to start to call it out in our communities, because I remember reading a book that the AHF did that talked about how lateral violence is, sorry, I have a cold, is directly stemmed from residential school and that experience. And if we don't address it, then our kids are going to have to deal with the same stuff that we're dealing with and that our parents dealt with. And so breaking the cycle in all areas from that intergenerational trauma is important. And lateral kindness, hashtag lateral love, is where I think we all need to be at. So, thank you.
Any more questions? I'm sure there are some for this amazing group.
Well, Jeff, first I want to thank the panel for the insight and the things you're doing. I want to commend you for the work. I'm from the Cree Nation of James Bay, and we're going through a rapid process of change as well. and really trying to reach out to our young people, because we feel that they need to get involved. They need to be part of the whole movement of moving our nation forward. And I've been involved in an exercise called capacity building, and that was an effort to educate the young people, get them excited, and to start looking at careers and ways to get involved. And I think a lot of the presentation you've made answers the question why. Okay, and I'd like to ask one question: how do we get him involved?
Can you repeat that, sorry, the question?
How do we get our youth involved?
So one of the commitments that I've personally made, as I shared earlier, was proceeding in a way that is more inclusive of all generations. And I'm not sure if you were, I don't be in the room earlier for my part of it. But in my professional capacities and the projects, when I develop a funding proposal, I earmark a portion of those funds to ensure that we're bringing in young people and elders and women to have a more inclusive and well-rounded contribution to whatever initiative that we're taking on. And then how you reach out to those youth, well, in my capacity with the Chiefs of Ontario, the starting point was the Youth Council, and really task them with the responsibility. I mean, they know how to go out and pull in the youth from the communities, and so engaging them and providing them with the resources to be able to go out and do the outreach and insert themselves into the conversation in a way that that they feel that they need to be included. So it's less about, at least for us in the projects that we've done through the several organizations that I mentioned, it's just about literally just opening the door. It's just open the door, provide, secure the resources, open the door, and then listen. And the youth will let you know what they need to get, X, Y, or Z done. And there'll be conversations about, what the end goal is, the vision, mission, objectives, and whatnot. But generally, I'm a huge fan of just opening the door and providing resources for support, and the rest gets sorted out through good old-fashioned conversation.
I totally agree. And if anyone wants to speak to the panel afterwards, they can. I know we were supposed to be done at 2:45, but I feel like this is an important conversation that everyone needs to hear, so we'll go to Peter's question.
So the whole panel is all women, which is amazing. It's actually super awesome to see. But I don't think I'm the only one who has this perception right now that there's not a lot of young Indigenous men leaders. And I'm going to keep this question vague because it's a topic all on itself. I just want to know what your thoughts are on that. Merci.
Democracy. I know I'm not on the panel, but this is a conversation that I've had many times. My previous role, I actually worked with youth for the Gwich'in Tribal Council at a regional level, and this is a conversation that I've had with many elders in the communities, and specifically ones that are helping our people in the residential area, or residential school area. Some of the things that they've observed is that over the last 40 years, there's been this big push to ensure that we empower our women within our communities. We tell them they can go and do whatever they want, go and get an education, and they are running all of our organizations in our communities. If you take an internal look within your community, the entire organization is run by women pretty much. And what we forgot to do is to encourage our young men at the same level that we are encouraging our women. The traditional gender roles within our communities aren't there anymore, in a way that we are now dependent on a wage-based economy. So we have a lot of young men dropping out of high school, grade 9, grade 10, grade 11, going and running equipment or getting into trades. And because of, one, young families, two, they're not encouraged in the same way that they should be, and three, there's this loss of this role, this traditional role within their communities. And I think that as a community, we need to start trying to redefine what that is in a modern context. And that they do have to have a foot in each door or be strong like two people, and ensure that our elders, the ones that are passing away faster and faster these days, are bringing our young men out hunting and teaching them how to skin a caribou the proper way, how to ensure that you're using everything and bringing the entire hide back to your community so that we can have those community forums where we're learning about the animals, we're tanning hides, we're skinning hides, we're you know, all of these traditional roles that our men have had that was equal to what the women were doing in our communities back then as well, and that's providing and creating clothing and everything that made our communities and nations strong. So one thing that I think we are all in agreement of, and Sashia spoke to earlier, is that I hope at next year's conference, every nation brings one young person with them. Every organization, every government, because we've had 5.5 hours of hearing from the next generation in the last 2 days. And I haven't been to any type of forum like this that we've been given that amount of time, because I'm only 30, and we're all really young, and as I said earlier, what has happened is that in the 70s and 80s, when all of you or some of you were 18 years old and being dragged into the boardroom, that has to happen again. And it needs to continue happening, not every 20, 30 years, but on a daily basis.
Thank you for the question. And I think in my own nation, we experience the same thing, where the women in my nation are incredibly strong, and as they always were. And so here becomes the question then, you know, I don't, certainly for women who are leading the way, like, to never feel like they have to apologize for that, firstly. But the second thing is, I really do feel that the way in which we view gender generally places men in positions where being vulnerable, showing emotion, those types of things in our society aren't always welcomed, and not just in our Indigenous communities, but broadly, right? If you look at women who are leading companies, if you look at the number of post-secondary graduation rates across our country and beyond, women are leading. This is not a trend that we are just experiencing in our own communities. This is an international trend that we need to start thinking about. And so when we think about men in our communities, from, you know, the roles that they may have or that they may have had, are they supported? Probably not in the way they should be, no. And I think that becomes a question to put to our cultural leaders and our elders to say, what do we need to do to create a space for those young men? I know in my community there's a lot of young men who are dealing with heavy alcoholism, social assistance, unmotivated, and it's heartbreaking. It's hard, right? You don't want to see that, but it becomes a responsibility to support them in what they need to do. I really feel it's a conversation that needs to be had amongst those young people, and some really strong cultural leaders in the community and elders. And I think our role as women in our communities, as being matriarchs, right, is to support and to provide a voice. So I think that also becomes a challenge to all of the male leaders in this room, is how do you, or people who identify as men, we cannot forget the two-spirited community in all of these gender role conversations. How do you support the young men in your community? What is it that you personally do to support them or to have them know that they're important or that they matter or that their voice needs to be heard? Those, I think, are conversations that need to happen in those spaces, and for us as outsiders of those conversations to continue to support in whatever way that looks like. But yeah, I do think it's something that needs to be addressed, and I also think it's important that in our societies, we're seeing more and more women taking on leadership positions, and that's okay too. So women who may be in elected positions or in positions of leadership in their communities that hasn't been done before, I know there are certainly cultural protocols and dynamics in each community, and I respect that. At the same time, we're looking at a shift, and culture can't be stagnant, right? It never was. There was always new things we were learning and we were adapting, and so I think it's our challenge now is to keep doing that and to not have to apologize for it.
I just want to add a personal story. It won't be long. Recently, about a month ago, I was home, and we do a fall harvest of fish. We set net, and by we, I mean my brothers and I, my cousins, and it was really interesting. So I had gone out to pull the first net, and then my cousin Matt and my brother Scott had gone out to pull the other two while some of us started cleaning one net. Anyhow, we end up, all together at one point, and the one cousin shares a story about how while they were pulling net, there was a boat of non-Indigenous men that went by. And he says, in front of all of us, what do we do? He turned to my brother Scott and he says, what do we do? They can't see us like this. And I was just so horrified, so shocked, so sad, so every emotion went through my head at that point. Because to me, our community, the men in our community, from what I can see, have a strong sense of identity and they're comfortable in who they are. And at that moment, what I thought was a reality had been toppled. And with my legal background, and obviously my very forceful personality, I was just like, no, that's not what we're doing here. Shame in the 90s, that's a thing of the past. We don't talk like that here. And then and as kindly as I could in my, big sister role, in my matriarch role, tried to, explain the parameters around our way of life and the inherent right that exists within this colonial framework and what that means today and how that plays out today. And it pained me to think that, and that question about, male leadership, is we all know that knowing who we are and where we come from is what gives us the confidence, what gives us the purpose, which allows us to step, in the world and navigate it and be leaders. And without that, if your foundation is unstable, we all know that, that sometimes, daily challenges, leadership opportunities, the ability to step up when we need to, sometimes wavers. And so from a male, in terms of understanding where we're at with our young men and the role of women, yeah, some of us are at the forefront leading the way, but that means that some of you, the previous generations, did something right that allowed us to get here. And it's not about just continuing on alone on our journey, it's about looking around us and making sure that we're bringing people along as we move forward. And so I just wanted to offer that story.
Thank you. We'll take one more question.
Oklama Les Dorn, Histuk Shitla, Yithluathat. My name is Les Dorn. I'm the elected president of the Klulit First Nation, and I just wanted to add the, not really a question, but I kind of a statement. Lateral violence, we see lots of it in our village, in our communities, and I think that part of that is directed by change. And when you go from the old Indian Reserve and INAC system to a modern day treaty nation, the challenges of what that are and how radical that those changes are very, very evident. I wanted to also add, when you talk about, and I want to say, I put my hands up to all of you ladies and acknowledge that why are there so many strong women out there leading? Because they can. Because they're amazing. And at the end of the day, not to take anything away from our boys or men, but we have a Warriors program back home, and soon we'll have a Warriorettes program, I think. I don't know what they're going to call it for the girls. But the Warriors program teaches capacity, creating capacity and teaching the life skills and the self-worth with fishing and hunting and harvesting traditional medicines and foods and such. And creating that self-worth at a young age is one of the most important things that we can do and instill in our children. That's language. Should be a huge part of that as well. And I think that what we need to do is that we need to get back to one thing, and one thing only, is that when in our tradition and our cultures, and I think that it's all of us, it doesn't matter what color that you are or what nation you're from, is respect. And getting that and getting that from your elders and keeping that is key. And I really want to go back to our kids again, is that you need to educate and train. And that's what it comes down to. And so with that, Jordan, I want to say hats off to you, my friend. Your suggestion, we will be back, and we will have one or two youth with us. Clicko.